Hi, I'm Anna Yang. I'm from Chatham House Sustainability Accelerator. I'll be your moderator for the session today. So the session today is insuring the uninsurable. How do we close the protection gap and the role of the insurance sector, and also what type of collaboration we can have. So for this panel, we have Emma Karhan, Head of Terrorism and Reinsurance Solution at Aon Benfield, Maarten van Aalst, Director, Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Change. We have Andrew Griffith, MP, UK Net Zero Business Champion, and also Claudia Thyme, Director, Emerging Market Development, AXA XL, and also co-chair of Sovereign Humanitarian Solution Working Group of the Insurance Development Forum. So we have this amazing panel today to join us to understand how can we close the insurance gap. I have a beginning, starting the question with all of you. And the session is, what are the key challenges involving the different stakeholders in closing the insurance gap? And is there the exam question, I would say, ensuring, how do we insure the uninsurable? Who would like to go first?
Right.
Thank you, Emma.
It's okay. I'll kick it off. So I think first we have to understand what's uninsurable.
Yeah.
And I think we've been talking about there are different aspects to what is uninsurable. Mm-hmm. There is what is insured at the moment that will become uninsurable. There is what is currently not insured that needs to be insured, and I think that's really what we call is the protection gap, and where insurance has not got a high penetration. And then there's probably the third part, or maybe I've missed a fourth part, is definitely the emerging risks and what we haven't actually quite understood yet to insure. And all three, if not other characteristics of what is uninsurable, are impacted by climate change and what is happening with the climate. I think when you start thinking about the challenges, each one has specific challenges. I think they're all face the issue of data and analytics, that we have to find different ways of looking at things going forward, and we have to find new ways to understand new risks. We look at Aon, we're looking at AI, we're looking at bringing in people that have different skill sets to which we have traditionally used. We're also looking at how we can bring science to the very traditional risk analysis that we've been doing, the risk modelling that we've been doing, but that's really Maarten's forte, so I won't go further on that one. And then there's, I think the last thing is understanding that data analytics is key to bringing in capital and bringing in support for these uninsurable risks.
Thank you. Since you mentioned Maarten, would you like to go after?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first problem for me, not as an insurance person, but as a humanitarian, is that things are uninsurable if there's no one there to pay the premiums, or if the people affected by the risks don't have any money to start with to pay the premiums, right? Now, in the end, we still pay a price. And in the current case, we as humanitarian organizations are picking up the bill in terms of rising response costs and still covering the humanitarian suffering that results if people don't have resilience, don't have an ability to come back up after a disaster. Now, if you're thinking of insurance, I think there is an element where some things are just not easily insurable. It will also get very expensive to be insured. So we need to avoid those risks in the first place, both by mitigation and by more effective adaptation. At some point also think about the solidarity, how we deal with those risks. And then in managing that, especially for those people that currently can't afford the premiums, I think we need to think about the ways we collaborate to bring the right solutions to the right pieces of that space. And what you were just referring to, the modeling, I mean, one of our challenges is that some of the best modeling, for instance, in the insurance sector, actually doesn't reach the most vulnerable people. So how can we build those bridges, make that knowledge not just an instrument that allows us to create the financial instruments, but also that allows us to manage risk. And I think that's one of the places where there's a lot of synergy also between the different actors in this space that we're not maximizing.
And I think part of it too is empowering those people that it's not reaching, or empowering those ones that don't understand it, to make better decisions. And it's not a competitive advantage to hold that knowledge. And I think that's one of the real challenges, to sort of spread that education and that understanding.
Thank you. Claudia.
Yeah, I would fully endorse that, and I think you heard a little bit in the previous panel about the efforts that are being made to make more data and risk analytics capabilities available in the Global South, right? Because the investment for it is all in the Global North. But I would like to turn it around in a way, because I think that we don't help ourselves. While we have to absolutely consider and address these challenges, I think that we also need to think of what closing the protection gap represents as an opportunity, right? And I think that's key in terms of driving the work that is necessary for that. First of all, the opportunity to strengthen and expand insurance markets, which, as we all know, correlate and are a key element in terms of economic stability for countries. Second, and I think you were referring a little bit to that, insurance is an important instrument in the very much needed shift from an ex post to an ex ante approach to paying and addressing crisis, right? It's not only that we pay the cost anyway, is that it's more cost effective. For every dollar that you pay before a disaster happens, you're saving at least $5 that you have to spend after the disaster. And so I think that's really, really critical, and I think that's a big topic that our industry is involved with. And finally, I think it's about going back to the core mission of our industry, which is not only to protect, but to enable progress, right? Because resilience is going to require build out of new infrastructure, build out of the technology that is needed to address it to a degree that is affordable globally. And finally, really, all the different paths that are going to enable the achieving net zero. And ultimately having a habitable planet. So I think that thinking of the opportunities is critical.
Thank you, Claudia.
Don't go last. Everything's already been said. But if I can reframe it, I mean, it's a really primary issue. I mean, it's a classic market demand and supply issue. It's education, which, if you go even further back, is about the understanding and the value of the role of insurance itself. So often it's too late into the room. It's an afterthought. It's not been designed in from the start. And that often speaks to capability. So partly it can just be awareness. It can also be the capability, because it's a sophisticated product. And to be purchased, you need some sort of symmetry on both sides, both jurisdictionally, but also on individuals. And so, to me, one of the big barriers we have to break down is how do we take this wonderful product that transfers wealth, transfers risks, enables things that simply wouldn't happen otherwise, but make sure that it can be purchased, it can be put in place, and you do that through capability as well as money flows. So we obviously have to have someone to fund that.
And I think that's a really key point, because not often is insurance associated with lowering the cost of capital. And people don't really make that connection that if it's not insured, it's not invested. And so when the bankers are at the table, the insurance industry should be at the table in equal measure. Absolutely. And I think that's really one of the big challenges we have in not necessarily the disaster risk financing, but getting that investment in the mitigation and the resilience and the adaptation going within particularly the Global South.
So on your point on the Global South, I think this is a question that I want to ask Maarten, and maybe Claudia, you can talk about it as well, which is whose responsibility then is to ensure that developing and emerging countries are protected, especially from the physical impact of climate change and the most vulnerable people that you're talking about.
Yeah, so that protection, again, has different components, right? I think that protection, there is an insurance protection gap, but there are also other elements such as adaptation that need to happen there. And it's all of that together, where part of that is very interwoven with development. So who pays for development? How do you pay for your own development as an individual, or starting your own little company, or the education of your children? All these questions are hanging together. To some extent, it's also a country's responsibility to support its citizens to do that. What is really different with climate change, and I think woven into your question about the uninsurable, is that it is getting worse. So development is getting harder. Individuals are being hit by problems that they have not necessarily caused themselves, because often the poorest people and the poorest countries are the ones who have historically emitted the least, and often are still the ones emitting the least. So they are suffering the consequences of something done by someone else. So I think it's legitimate, for instance, in the Paris Agreement that we're discussing this week in Glasgow, again, there is that 100 billion. That won't get us near far enough to address the scale of risks that we're facing here. So one of the questions is also, how do we get that to the right people, and how do we use it most effectively? And that to me is key. I think there is a global responsibility for the problems we've caused, but then there's also a responsibility upon everyone to get the best possible development outcomes, and that means asking the right questions about how we manage risk.
Claudia.
Yes, I agree with that. I think that, we talk a lot about public-private partnerships, and I think that they are critical to drive resilience. But I think it's also collaboration across industries, right? If you take us in the insurance industry, collaboration with technology companies in order to, for example, get claims payouts, not to a ministry, but directly and quickly to people that are most vulnerable, and ensuring that they have the access to that technology so that that can be done, even in countries where there are no social protection programs in place. So collaboration across all parties is critical. But you also mentioned the question of how, Maarten, and I think that's also important. I think, figures, and it's about data, but it's also about setting targets in how we collaborate. I mean, in the Insurance Development Forum, we have a program that I call 20 by 25. It's called actually the Tripartite Program because it involves the German Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, IDF, and the UN Development Program. And it's to deliver technical assistance, but also insurance solutions to 20 countries by 2025. And in looking at the tremendous engagement that we've had of the industry in delivering on this, I think that having a clear target is incredibly helpful. So that's one thing in terms of the how, but also in terms of also being pragmatic, because I think we all recognize that there's a sense of urgency. And in collaborating, we need to be able to learn from each other. We need to be able to not look for the sense of ownership. I did this, I developed this, and not reinvent the wheel, but take what is already there and use it or maybe improve it. But we need to move forward quickly. So I think being pragmatic is very important. And finally, I think that we also need to reduce complexity, because really countries, I traveled called by chance with a minister from Malawi. And she was telling me how she was incredibly overwhelmed by the number of organizations and acronyms that she needed to start to understand. And we need to make it easier for the countries that need it the most to access the finance and the technical capabilities and technical assistance that they need. So we need to basically redesign the climate finance architecture and make it easier to work with.
I think too, just coming back to being pragmatic, I think there is a predisposition of the North to tell the South what they need. And I think there needs to be a trust going to the countries that need it most, that they will tell you what they need, and not feel that because you have superior data, you have superior analytics, that you know what they need and what's best for them. And I think that's one of the crucial bits that builds a mistrust from the South to the North, or from the governments to these organisations that come in and say, I'll tell you what you need. And I think that's another element, that there has to be humility, to your point, Claudia, about what's there, but also that we don't have the answers despite thinking we do. As someone said to me once, if I give money to a hospital, I don't tell them where to put it. I let them work out who needs it the most.
They understand their risks best, right?
Exactly.
They're on the ground.
Yeah, and it's often risk management in very data-sparse areas, right? Particularly if you want to look at long-term trends, we often just don't know in those places. The only thing we can do is ask people, what are you already confronting with? What might be changing? But also, how would you deal with things if it would get worse?
Listening.
Get very, like you said, very practical, very pragmatic.
Andrew.
Well, the question was how do we finance it and how do we pay for it? So we're here at COP, and one of the big things that's been achieved this week was we've delivered on the unfunded cheque from Paris. So we've now got the 100 billion a year from 2023 onwards. Over the life of the next 5 years, it'll average that. But it dwarfs into insignificance when you either look at the global capital flows, the 130 trillion that the Glasgow Financial Alliance has assembled, but also trade. And so it's really important that we're actually producing products that are going with the grain. It's private enterprise that's going to lift everybody up. And so, again, we have a key role to play with. I completely agree about, we can't have this alphabet soup of all the IDBs, all these different standards. Again, there's been some good progress. I'm sure it's work in progress on things like Fast Infra, which is an infrastructure investment standard for sustainable development, and the new International Sustainable accounting standards. That is something we need, and I don't think it's not anyone telling anyone what to do, but it is also simplifying so that that's accessible and everybody knows what the hurdle is to jump over.
I mean, from what I hear everybody saying, I mean, it is complex. There are many stakeholders. We have imperfect information, and we don't actually understand the completeness of the risk ahead of us.
But
I'm
it's
sure
so solvable.
Apart from that,
But we can do this.
We definitely can. We have to do it, right? It's like there is an imperative from us for the next generation. We have to solve this, and also just like you said, from I wouldn't say humanitarian perspective, but just from a solidarity.
We have a
perspective.
morality.
Yeah, exactly.
We have a moral
It's
obligation.
also a huge opportunity.
Yeah.
People we're chasing in the West, low returns on capital because we don't have enough growth. Why not try and deploy capital in all of the markets in the world where they expect to see explosive growth?
Yeah. And so, I mean, one thing that I want to be able to also unpack a little bit more is, and which is the point that I was talking about, the multiple stakeholders. I want to maybe bring this to Maarten. So, there are different stakeholders in this very complex systems in the humanitarian work, in finance, insurance, government, private sector. What, in your view, what are the different, I would say, puzzles or different stakeholders? How would you think they can collaborate better, or how these puzzles should fall into place so that we can be more pragmatic about it, but also we can deliver some results? Big question.
Yeah, well, I mean, delivering of results in the humanitarian system is to some extent happening every day, right? It's not like we're waiting until someone's got an agreement on loss and damage before we help people that have been hit by a disaster.
True.
So, and to some extent, as I said, that cost is being borne. We're feeling the pressure, though. I mean, our humanitarian budgets are under huge strain.
Yeah.
So we're very grateful to the UK government, but also individual citizens who are donating their scarce resources for us to be able to do that life-saving work. But it's not a given, and it's under stress. So we're always looking for solutions to be more effective. One of the examples is that we're acting more ahead of disasters. So we have, instead of standard operating procedures, if we get the next storm in Bangladesh, so we can help people after it's happened, we now pay out before the disaster. So people actually get cash in their hands and are able to take their own measures that actually reduce the impact on their livelihood. That is much more effective, more cost effective, also more respectful to people, that they can actually take those actions. It requires us to have financial systems that pay out before the disaster based on a forecast with a certain amount of uncertainty. So there's risk modeling involved, but it also requires partnerships in our own funding instruments that we need to innovate. So it's that sort of space. One thing on the climate side, so that's where I welcome the conversation, for instance, with the representatives of the insurance industry, where I think we can learn from each other in terms of risk analytics, but also in terms of the sort of solutions that may work for those financing streams. It requires the donor community. The UK government has been important, German government, but many others, to become more flexible. We only got the money in the past after a disaster had already happened. There is now more flexibility to use that money more effectively with better results. It also requires a genuine focus on the ball. And one of the challenges I sometimes see with the climate circus, if I may call it that to some extent, all the acronyms that we were referring to before, is that we are creating more obstacles for people to actually collaborate and work together effectively, rather than, again, having our eyes on the ball and just looking at what works.
I think it comes back to what Claudia also said around the expertise, and there are so many competing players and ownership. I think you were talking about, this was my idea. I think one of the things we all have to sort of almost delineate is what's our role and what's our responsibility here, because everybody feels that it's their responsibility and no one really understands what is the most critical role they can play in this game, right? So, for example, the insurance industry has a huge role to play as a bridge between risk and the private and the public sector and being a bridge. I think the government has a massive role to play in how they accelerate people to really take advantage of expertise and data and all the fantastic innovation that happens around economies. And so what we often find, or what I've seen, is that you have people sort of crossing over into different laneways. I mean, we're great on risk and analytics. Let us do it. Don't have competing business models. Let the world, the private sector come in and take the part of the risk that makes sense for them, that's sustainable, and not try and crowd them in with the multilaterals. I mean, Larry Fink talked about the role of the multilaterals being reimagined and rethought.
Yes.
And in all of this, and he talked about all this supply, and in all of this, we talk about all this money, but no one talks about the demand. No one talks about providing that support to the countries. Who's taking that role and responsibility? And so I really think that, to your point about restructuring the climate finance, that has to come into it, because that's what collaboration's about. It's not about everybody sitting around a table going, I have this idea. It's about, I recognise you're really good at that, you go and do that, and then I'll take what you're doing and do what I'm really good at and achieve this goal. And I think that's where it all kind of gets a bit muddy and we fall over ourselves and create hurdles.
Yeah, I think it's not only about not crowding in, but not crowding out the private sector,
out,
right?
exactly.
But I think everybody has their role to play, because one thing we haven't talked about is, as you said, the demand side, right? It's not easy. It's not as if the insurers come and every government jumps and says, yes, I've been waiting to buy insurance. Insurance is not, can be complex, right? And so putting in place the enabling environment, whether it's regulation, whether it's regulation that allows for the use of technology like for parametrics, or whether it is that the government can buy insurance that ultimately benefits a third party, right? All of the things need to be in place. And development, you were talking about development, not only protecting development, but enabling it. There are UN organizations dedicated to that. And so I think that we all have a role to play, and we need to find the lines and find the way to collaborate. So as you say, we don't step on each other's feet, but rather are able to move and progress quickly together. It's so needed.
Yeah, and so, and we keep on coming back to collaboration, which I think is, one of the most important things. But I would imagine that there would be a sequencing question, no? Because if you're saying we have to pass the ball around,
I don't think it's that simple that it's a sequence. No. I think it has to be, it's almost like it's not even it's almost like we're all going to tie for first place, right, in a running race, but we can't do it without each other. I mean, there's none of us. The public sector can't do it, we can't do it, donors can't do it. It has to be a clear, almost like a project.
But you have to have enough people on the pitch.
Yep.
And that's sometimes
you've got to have enough people on the pitch.
We're one shy, because it's...
But it's the right people
it's us. It's
as
not
well.
necessarily the donor or the project leader, because they don't necessarily have that capability. And that's where I think there are interventions that we can still do to lift people up, whether it's, as prosaic as you guys bringing in secondees, establishing scholarship programs to try and level up that level of knowledge. Because we can collaborate all we want, but if there are voices who are actually on the ground managing and wearing these risks every day who aren't in the room, that's necessarily doesn't create the right outcome.
Then the collaboration is not complete, right? I fully agree. I think that it is very much collaboration needs to include the local
and I know you're very
actors and
international
players.
businesses, so it's...
But it's also, I think the other thing, everyone feels that when you collaborate, you've got to have everybody there. You don't, right? We don't have to have the whole world sitting there collaborating. It's almost like an American football team. When you're on the offense, you have the offense team there, and when you're on the defense, you have the defense. And then
Never
bring in the
understood
kicker.
that. Never understood that. It's
Not the greatest analogy, but
not sure
they're all playing to their
not
skills.
sure we're here allowed to criticize some other country's favorite sport.
You're right, though. It's definitely not collaboration for the sake of collaboration.
Collaboration. It has to be the right people.
With some clear, actionable
And people have to be
outcomes.
grown up about it too, right?
Yeah, that actually is a really important point.
Yeah.
Not everybody is very grown up about it.
Well, and the right collaborations for the right purposes. Right?
Yes,
so
exactly.
it starts with your eyes on the ball and thinking about what you need for that particular case, and then bringing the right people and not having institutional obstacles or funding hurdles or whatever to prevent people from actually getting together to manage these problems together. But it doesn't always mean that everyone has to be on every single problem.
No.
I'd actually say a quite quick delineation of who is needed for this one is often what's needed.
And I think that also demands a bit of a balance between standardizing, because on the one hand, to move quickly, you want to have some standards approaches and processes so that you can copy paste and keep going.
Yeah.
And at the same time, every country is different, every city is different, and you have to tailor to their needs. But I was going to add another point, which is also about the coalition of the willing, because I find it really interesting. I think that here at COP in Glasgow, there are 65 mayors, city mayors, and 75% of people live in cities.
Yeah.
And they have been, in my view, very much at the forefront of understanding and looking to tackle climate risk. And I think that that's exactly what we need to find, right? It start with the ones that are ready and not start, but it's great when you have partners that are actually understanding and are ready to go and you can collaborate quickly. We cannot leave anyone behind, but we need to find that balance.
Do you know what, Claudia? I also think, we're talking about insuring the uninsurable. One of the things I think is the responsibility of the private sector is to go back to their entrepreneurial roots and take more risk in insuring risk, right? Because when the insurance industry started, when the financing industry started, no one had the data. No one, they took a punt. And I think, I'm not saying you take a punt, but I think we have to get to that, what is good enough to get us to the first stage to improve what we're doing, rather than trying to come with this complete solution the whole time. There has to be a balance between, let's get to the first stage. It's not going to be perfect, but you know what? It's going to get us 75% of the way there. We'll learn, we'll take that experience, we'll gather the data, and we'll come back and we'll make it better again. And I think that's one of the things that, when you, particularly in the insurance industry, because we're so obsessed with data analytics, that we get caught up on that. It's got to be perfect before we take that on.
And at businesses, on the other hand, we are willing to take risks, right? I think that's one thing in the collaboration between the private and public sector. Because, of course, when you respond to your constituents, you have a responsibility to be able to be transparent about how was this done, where was the money used, and what metrics are we using. And at the same time, when you work with developing countries and they are going through a learning process and we're looking to not just deliver something but enable them, you are going to have to be able to pilot, to experiment, and some of that is going to fail.
Yep.
And that has to be an acceptable part of the process.
You don't try, you don't win.
And you have to value that capability building in itself. So that process of iterative learning and failure is nevertheless building capability, which is what we long-term need.
Yeah, exactly.
So we all agree about that, which is we have to move forward while we learn with imperfect information. Is it happening now, though?
I think we're getting much better on the information front, Anna. I think that, to be honest, if I look, just in the organizations that I'm involved with, right? So AXA is, for example, founding partner of something called the Ocean, and I'm going to blank on the name, Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, ORA. And it's launching here at COP26 something called the Coastal Risk Index, which is looking at basically nature-based solutions. It shows not only what is the impact of having or not having corals, mangroves particularly, but it also looks at the horizon 30 years, 50 years. That is incredibly valuable. A lot of people live in coastal areas. The Insurance Development Forum, I don't want to repeat because I know the previous session talked about the GRI, but we also signed a partnership with the V20, which is actually 55 countries, misnomer, but the V20 to deliver to their country something that is going to be called the Global Risk Modeling Alliance. And that is very much about enabling people to deliver the models, develop the models that they need, so to sort of fill the risk model gap. And it's not about giving them the models, but it's actually bringing experts both from industry and the public sector in order to do the work together with them. So involve people from governments, from local agencies, from universities. So bring that richness of the local knowledge. It's not always data, but it's knowledge that becomes data, access to data, and do it together. And I think that we are making progress, and we have technology that allows us to capture data. So I think that we are moving forward in that area.
Not fast enough.
I think that's the best summary. I think maybe of the whole of where we are on climate, right? We have moved since Paris. It's not like...
No.
I think we have seen a number of really important announcements already this week, so I remain hopeful. But overall, we're making some progress, but not enough. And I think in this field, it's exactly the same.
And I think...
one concern, though, especially on that insurance gap, I worry, especially for the most vulnerable, that if we don't fix this quickly enough, their resilience erodes further and further, and the problem becomes bigger, and the uninsurability becomes a bigger problem.
Yeah.
I think to Claudia's point about the data too is we have to think differently and not look to the regular data points. You know, so we see a lot of Instech and new ideas coming through at Aon, and we're trying to harness that through AI and, you know, bring different types of data into the picture because they're different types of risks. One thing too, I think we have to be very careful is not to get lost just in physical risk.
Yeah. For sure.
And we have to talk about the fact that this involves restructuring economies and restructuring economies on which people are incredibly reliant on for their well-being that are very fossil fuel focused.
Right.
And that is another whole area that we are not doing enough of from de-risking that transition.
Yeah. How do we transition?
And being creative about it.
Yeah.
And go back to people, because it's really,
Yeah,
you know, we as
people.
insurers, of course, talk about assets, right? And we talk about losses, which is damage assets. But it's social risk, and behind all of these numbers that we're talking about are people and their lives and livelihoods.
Yeah.
And that is the sense of urgency.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to ask a question, but then you took me into the people. And then I think this is actually, you know, when we talk about climate mitigation, and you're you know, I'm depending on the day. Some days I'm really pessimistic if you look at the numbers, but some days just like, well, you know, like you said, since Paris, a lot of things have moved forward. And I think that what I would want us for maybe just the last almost 3 minutes, is we all feel that progress is being made, but we need more. So this last 3 minutes, how do we talk about ambition-raising mechanism? What is the role of innovation? What is the role of different kind of radical collaboration that we can do to do that, you know, that further push, so that 5 years from now or next year, we don't come back and say, oh, you know, it was enough, no, not quite enough.
You go first. I went first last
time. Let me
time.
give you an analogy. So I think what we're looking for, the closest analogy is what we've done on the vaccine. If we were sitting here, you know, not even 2 years ago when COP would have been, you know, we just wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be meeting face to face given the ravages that we've had. And those haven't been equal either. So it's a good case point. But we've seen private capital, we've seen governments, we've seen the ingenuity of science, and we've seen the capability of business deployed to really tackle that crisis. That is absolutely what we need to do in terms of tackling the climate crisis now. We have the technology. I mean, my slightly bullish assessment is all of the technology, and others agree with this, all of the technology that we need to solve this exists. It's just not been deployed at scale, you know, really not been deployed at scale. You know, we're talking about things that we've got a long, long road ahead of us. But we have that. You know, we are increasingly assembling the private capital, and we've got businesses and supply chains of great ingenuity around the world. So the optimistic scenario is, look, we're shading in some of these things. You know, often that does come back down to capability. Capability is not evenly distributed. And so even if capital flows freely, there's other points of friction in the system. Standards aren't there. Bodies, you know, although we talked earlier about collaboration, there are a plethora of bodies operating in this space, and they don't collaborate. They do rub up against each other, and they present a confusing tapestry, which is another sort of friction. So we're seeing great progress at COP. You know, it's not hard to be too positive when we've seen great commitments on things like phasing out coal, commitments on methane for a whole new category. So lots of progress, but lots still to do. Just keeping it short.
Let's go this way. Claudia.
I think that whatever we think of mitigation, ultimately the reality is that of the funds that are made available based on the Paris Agreement for the countries that need it most, at the moment it's about 2% that is dedicated to resilience. And it needs to be a 50-50% split, because we need it, because the countries need it. Because to us, living in the developed world or living here in Europe, you know, the issue of climate change is something that to people it sounds like it's in the future, right? And it's very difficult to connect that plastically to the future. But when you talk to the very people that are here at COP, I mean, they're experiencing it here today already. And given what is already baked into where we are standing today, what we know is coming, we need to put more funds into resilience. There's no way around the fact that to be able to enable resilience and all this wonderful collaboration in one way or another, countries are gonna need funds.
Yeah. Maarten?
Yeah, so I could not agree more. It's already with us. That's also where I take a bit of hope, also again from the science. The conversation is very different from even 5 years ago. It's partly because it's hitting us everywhere. So we've seen the last 2 years, the most deadly humanitarian disaster in our IFRC disaster hit lists was the heat wave in Europe.
Yep.
We've seen the Canadian heat wave, we've seen the Australian bushfires, the European floods, you name them. So there is a lot that reminds people all the time. Now, the hardest hit are still those in the poorest countries, and we're not reaching them at the moment. We are, again, making progress. The Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership, for instance, that's being reinvigorated here in Glasgow is a good example. So we are making good steps, but that needs to be scaled much more quickly.
Emma.
I don't think we're asking us. I think there's some fantastic things going on. We're very optimistic, and everyone's talking about the capital that's been raised and all these companies that are doing things. What they're not talking about is what Larry Fink referred to the other day, is that there's a huge arbitrage from publicly disclosed capital into private capital, and who knows what they're doing. We're not talking about the roles and responsibilities. We're not talking about what we're getting wrong in this process. And I think that's one of the things that has to be discussed more openly, and not worry about how we offend a multilateral bank because we're telling them that they're crowding out the private sector, that they should be focusing on this. I think that's one of the biggest things that is almost our biggest challenge, is to face up to what we're doing wrong.
Yeah. That actually is really, I'm going to go home and reflect about it. Also, maybe not worried to be being rude. So we are now out of time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Andrew, Claudia, Maarten, and Emma. Thank
Thanks,
you for
Anna.
such an exciting, interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much,
you,
Anna.
Thank you.
Thanks.